Good evening, Black people and all allies fighting for Black liberation, Black prosperity, and Black joy. I'm Charles Blow, and welcome to Black History Moments. Black history is more than just a month and more than just any one single event. It happens every single day. Although some view Black history as a threat, we here at Black News Channel understand that Black history is vital to the future of American democracy. Black history is illuminating if we are brave enough to be made students of it. So now we'd like to give you some of the Black History Moments from the month of May. Every Black movement in America has been accompanied by a strong Black press. The abolitionist movement included Frederick Douglass's The North Star, which said of itself, "It has long been our anxious wish to see in the slave-holding, slave-trading, and Negro-hating land a printing press and paper permanently established under the complete control and direction of the immediate victims of slavery and oppression." Reconstruction had newspapers like the New Orleans Tribune, the country's first Black daily newspaper that called itself the organ of the oppressed. The Tribune played a key role in Louisiana's Constitution of 1868, a radical document that gave Black people, Black men at least, the right to vote and other civil rights, and established an integrated free public school system and guaranteed Blacks equal access to public accommodations. The civil rights movement had magazines like Ebony and Jet. It was Jet magazine that printed the image of Emmett Till's mutilated body. Till's lynching has been called the Big Bang of the civil rights movement. But before that, the Great Migration had publications like Robert Abbott's Chicago Defender, which published its first edition on this day in 1905. Abbott called the Great Migration the Second Emancipation. His Defender was indispensable in encouraging, documenting, and providing a moral and civic frame for the movement. Abbott's Defender was heroic in its heretical nature, like Martin Luther's thesis nailed to the door of the white South. And here we are, in this moment, in this movement, and it now has, as part of its strong, heroic Black press, this channel, and this show, and this journalist. His time in office was a beacon of hope for Black South Africans and Black people around the world. In his inaugural address, Mandela called for unity and progress.
The time for the healing of the wounds has come. The moment to bridge the chasms that divide us has come. The time to build is upon us.
Not much power was fundamentally and permanently shifted to Black South Africans under Mandela's administration. Despite a new constitution, the formation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was established under Mandela to investigate human rights violations, and promises for social and economic programs directed towards Black people, not much of the progress he envisioned was realized. The country recast itself as a rainbow nation of racial egalitarianism. The country taught its children this rainbowism philosophy of race, but critics charged that the philosopher erased or diminished Black oppression in its relentless positivity. It just goes to show that a Black president, a first Black president, in a land riven by race can't be expected to change it all during his tenure. Sound familiar? White supremacy is durable and defiant. What took generations to erect will likely take generations to dismantle. This day, 53 years ago, was a Sunday, Mother's Day. After days on the road, caravans full of activists from across the country converged on Washington, D.C. They came to take part in a 6-week-long protest in support of the cause Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been fighting for when he was assassinated just 1 month earlier.
Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
King was referring to the Poor People's Campaign, a coordinated initiative to highlight issues of economic inequality among people of all races, conceived in 1967 by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. A week after her husband's memorial service, Coretta Scott King led a march with leaders of the campaign to demand an economic Bill of Rights, which included a guaranteed basic income, full employment for all American citizens, and a plan for more low-income housing. The dream of Dr. King and the impact of the initial Poor People's Campaign can still be felt decades later. In 2018, Reverend Dr. William Barber and others launched a contemporary Poor People's Campaign.
It is immoral to have 37 million people without health care. It is immoral not to pay living wages when we know we can do it. It is immoral that people don't have single-payer health care for everybody as a matter of human rights, and children have access to public education.
That fight continues today with a push for this country's 32 million low-wage workers to receive a minimum wage increase, which would be the first since 2009. Data from the Federal Reserve Economic Study released this month shows that the average sale price for a house in the U.S. has increased more than 45% since that time. The cost for food and beverages has risen 24%, and medical expenses rose 39%. President Biden recently called for a minimum wage to be raised to $15 an hour.
No one should work 40 hours a week and live in poverty.
During a planning meeting for the 1968 march, King was quoted saying this of the movement: "I think it is necessary for us to realize that we have moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights. And yet, here we are in 2021, still fighting for both." On this day in 1955, Sam Jones of the Chicago Cubs became the first black pitcher to throw a no-hitter in the major leagues.
Watch it now. Jones against Thomas. The pitch. Strike three. Ball, strike three. It's a no-hitter for Jones. Pandemonium out on the field. The field mob scene. Jones is being pounded by well-wishers, players, and fans alike.
But before him, it was Hilton Smith, who threw the Negro American League's first no-hitter in 1937. And even before that, it was Claude Grier, who in 1926 accomplished the feat in the third ever Colored World Series. Hilton and Grier's gems are just a few of a dozen no-hitters thrown in the Negro Leagues before the majors integrated. Baseball welcomed black players after Jackie Robinson famously broke the color barrier, signing with the Dodgers in 1947. Names like Willie Mays and Frank Robinson and Henry Hank Aaron would follow. There's no doubt that many Negro League players, pitchers especially, could have etched their spots into the Major League record books if baseball welcomed them earlier, but their numerous accomplishments for decades were overshadowed. That was until December 2020, when Negro League statistics from 1920 to 1948 officially became classified as Major League, marking a long overdue acknowledgement of players who didn't have the opportunity to play in the American or National Leagues because of racism and segregation. John Thornton, the official historian of Major League Baseball, wrote, "The perceived deficiencies of the Negro League structure and scheduling were born of MLB's exclusionary practices, and denying them Major League status has been a double penalty." He went on to say, granting MLB status to the Negro Leagues a century after their founding is profoundly gratifying. So today, not only do we celebrate Sam Jones, but all the black players who were never recognized for their accomplishment on the baseball diamond. We'll be back with more Black History Moments after this. On this day in 1804, Lewis and Clark set off on an expedition to explore lands west of the Mississippi River following the Louisiana Purchase. The crew of roughly 45 men included unmarried soldiers, a French Indian interpreter, boaters, and an enslaved man named York. York was a 30-something-year-old who had been enslaved by Clark since he was a child. He proved to be an indispensable member of the group. He helped build shelters, handle firearms, hunting for food, and help care for the sick. He also helped in negotiations between the explorers and the roughly 50 Native American tribes they encountered along the journey. According to the National Park Service, when the Corps successfully completed the 2-year expedition, every man received double pay and 320 acres of land. That is, every man except York. York did, however, request compensation from Clark. Not money or land, but his freedom, a request that Clark denied. Then York asked if Clark would hire him out so that he could move to Louisville, Kentucky permanently to be with his enslaved wife. No dice, also denied by Clark. Letters Clark wrote to his brother revealed that he did not like the idea of York wishing to live near his wife and wanted him to improve his attitude or else risk being hired out to a more severe enslaver. It wasn't until about a decade after the expedition that York was finally freed. In 1832, Clark told author Washington Irving that he freed York and gave him horses and a wagon. York started his own freight hauling business that unfortunately failed. But Clark says it was because York lacked discipline and hated freedom so much that he decided to return to him to enslavement. Clark claimed York died on the journey back to St. Louis. In 2001, President Bill Clinton promoted York posthumously to the rank of Honorary Sergeant, Regular Army. On this day in 1954, the landmark Supreme Court ruling on Brown v. Board of Education unanimously outlawed segregated schools in the United States.
Shortly after noon, Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States, began to read a unanimous opinion of the Supreme Court, ruling in 5 cases in which 5 Negro children sought the right to go to the same schools as white children.
In the final decision, Chief Justice Earl Warren famously wrote, quote, "Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." During the height of desegregation in the 1980s, the achievement gap between black and white students narrowed at the most rapid rate ever recorded according to the National Assessment of Education Progress. And black graduation rates also rose at desegregated schools, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research. Despite these facts, Brown v. Board was a tremendously layered outcome with a complex ripple effect in the black community. Black children were left to cope with abrupt changes such as elaborate student assignment plans, forced busing, and longer commuting times. At the same time, black institutions were shut down to make desegregation more convenient for whites. And thousands of black educators, many times unjustly, lost their jobs when schools merged. Then came resegregation. In the 1990s, a series of Supreme Court decisions made it easier for school districts to get out from under court supervision. Rulings like these contributed to the eventual resegregation of many school systems. In the 2000s, politicians embraced new ideas for closing the achievement gap, including No Child Left Behind's testing regimes, charter schools, and a push to make teachers more accountable for their performance. The number of mostly black schools more than tripled between 1988 and 2016. Resegregation led to widening of the achievement gap. The reality is that Brown v. Board didn't create a utopia. It was a ruling by a government that provided no clear plan for the success of non-white students. So while we remember the historic case, we acknowledge how far we've come and how far we still have to go in fulfilling the promise of equal education. On this day in 1896, the United States Supreme Court handed down its notorious ruling on Plessy v. Ferguson. This served as a bedrock for the separate but equal doctrine that fueled Jim Crow, the South's response to Reconstruction. The now infamous conclusion saw government declare it unconstitutional for races to be kept separate. This came after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were supposed to give black citizens equal treatment under the law. The landmark case originated with Louisiana's Separate Care Act of 1890 that required coloreds and whites to sit in separated compartments, in separated cars. What makes the origins of the legislation interesting was it was difficult to enforce the act in a state like Louisiana that had a large mixed-race population. The plaintiff in the case, Homer Adolph Plessy, was actually described as 7/8 white and 1/8 black. As one author put it, fair-skinned enough to cause confusion. Plessy was recruited to test the law. Plessy was arrested after he refused to give up his seat in defiance of the act. Anyone refusing to sit in their assigned coach would be fined $25 or imprisoned 20 days. Plessy elevated his grievance all the way to the United States Supreme Court. After reviewing the case, the court found that the law didn't violate the 14th Amendment, that the amendment was designed to make everyone equal under the law, but it wasn't intended to eliminate distinctions based on race. In the 7-1 ruling, Justice Brown said it's not a violation of the Constitution as long as the facilities are equal. Thus was born the separate but equal doctrine. One justice did not participate. The long dissenter was Justice John Marshall Harlan, who famously and naively said the Constitution is colorblind. No, the Constitution is not colorblind, and it has often been used to enforce the color line. More Black History Moments coming up right after this.
We are oppressed. We are exploited. We are downtrodden. We are denied not only civil rights, but even human rights.
On this day in 1925, Malcolm X was born in Omaha, Nebraska. The civil rights icon rose to prominence in the early 1960s as a minister for the Nation of Islam, advocating for African American empowerment and liberation. I have to personally thank Malcolm X and his biographer Alex Haley for having a major influence on my ease with language. When I read in his book that he copied the words and definitions of the entire dictionary in notebooks, I committed myself to doing the same thing. Now, I didn't make it through the entire dictionary, but I learned to read everything with that notebook and dictionary at the ready. When I encountered a word I didn't know, I wrote it and its dictionary in my notebook. I do that to this day in the notes on my phone. Anyway, Malcolm X's rhetoric is most widely circulated and remembered for fueling Black nationalist ideology and popularizing Black power movements. Yet, the media narrative about Malcolm often only seems to focus on his rage and negates both the evolution during his transformative years and the positive and essential voice he was for the soul of Black America during a critical time.
It's not hate to say that we were kidnapped and brought here, it's true. It's not hate to say that we were Jim Crow, discriminated and segregated, it's true.
And those of you who are familiar with it know that in America, democracy is hypocrisy. Right.
Part of Malcolm's renaissance came after his split from the Nation of Islam and a trip to Mecca and several African countries in 1964. It was in that same year that he founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity as a way to internationalize the Black struggle, shifting his focus from civil rights to human rights. Malcolm X eventually expressed the need for multiracial alliances and began to work with other civil rights leaders who he had previously spoken out against. His promotion of Black autonomy, independence, and maximizing black political and economic power inspired millions of activists. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated while delivering a lecture at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. It is an injustice to remember him as merely a one-dimensional, polarizing figure, centering his image only in black rage. To fully appreciate Malcolm X, we must celebrate the wholeness of his character, maturation of his views, and the complexity of his existence as a black man. Even more Black history on the way next. Every summer, we celebrate Juneteenth, a day commemorating the creeping end of slavery in the United States, as word of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, signed 2 years prior, finally made its way to Galveston, Texas, thought to be one of the deepest strongholds of the Confederacy, thus signaling freedom for the last of those in bondage. Hawaii passed legislation earlier this year, making it the 49th state committed to honoring the holiday, leaving just one holdout, South Dakota. South Dakota's Senate passed a measure earlier this year to observe Juneteenth as a day of remembrance, but it didn't get through that state's House. Even with South Dakota as a holdout, it is fair to say that Juneteenth has finally started to garner the attention it deserves. But Juneteenth is not the only Freedom Day worthy of celebrating. On this day in 1865, a month after the Civil War was over, the words of Lincoln's proclamation were read in Tallahassee, Florida. This was the month before the word of emancipation made its way to Galveston. In Florida, today has become known as Emancipation Day. While it's been observed by many since 1865, 2021 is the first time that Florida Emancipation Day is recognized as an official Leon County holiday.
This year, the city of Tallahassee, along with the Leon County Board of Commissioners, have passed a resolution codifying May 20th as the official emancipation date for the state of Florida, and also a paid holiday for its employees.
Originally, newly freed black people celebrated this announcement with a picnic at Bull Pond in Tallahassee, now called Lake Ella. Similar observations take place in cities around the state like Jacksonville and St. Augustine. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, there was no television or radios, no internet or email. News moved slowly, and it was in enslavers' interest to make it move even more slowly. Also, the nation was in the middle of a civil war. The news came to the enslaved in different states at different times. We owe it to the ancestors to celebrate every known moment of the first time the sweet words of freedom first landed on black ears and filled black people's hearts. Happy Emancipation Day, Florida.
It's all a dream. I used to read Word Up magazine. I love it when you call me Big Papa. 94. Now I explore new horizons.
I moved to Brooklyn in 1994. Christopher Biggie Smalls Wallace was a rising star. 3 years later, killed in Los Angeles, he was a fallen god. Biggie was Brooklyn. He was the spirit of it. He was the king of it. He was just 2 years younger than me, so he was the soundtrack of the New York that I found and I fell in love with. So it is only fitting that I celebrate the fact that this is his birthday. He was born on this day in 1972.
Yeah, the presence, vocal presence and physical presence on the stage, he looked like a king. He's a true king of hip hop.
Biggie was the greatest rapper of all time, period. I don't even want to talk about it. Fight me. He was revered, emulated, and to this day has sold over 50 million records worldwide. With his impeccable delivery and collection of famously quotable lines, for a time he encapsulated East Coast hip-hop. Biggie brought a mass appeal that transcended the genre. For major artists who were his contemporaries or followed him, Jay-Z, Kanye West, Wallace helped create the blueprint. His fingerprints to this day are all over pop culture. The late, great Ruth Bader Ginsburg was nicknamed the Notorious RBG, and she happily embraced the moniker, including it in her 2018 documentary.
Hey, and if you don't know, now you know, Mr. President.
Like the musical Hamilton, Representative Hakeem Jeffries invoked the words of Biggie during the Senate trial of Donald Trump, capping his speech with, "If you don't know, now you know." These lyrics came from a song that catapulted the Notorious One to superstardom, Juicy. The song embodied what was so powerful about the street poet whose central theme was hope, aspiration, and upward mobility, and it proved attractive to people around the world. Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams declared Biggie's birthday a holiday in 2016, and Biggie was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame last year. Biggie was tragically shot to death on March 9th, 1997. He left behind just 2 albums with a handful of features and guest appearances, but his impact on us was immeasurable. He has become patron saint of the streets. He is the hood ambassador to the world. The livest one from Bed-Stuyvesant began his short life, dazzling life, today. On this day in 1918, Coleman Young, first black and longest-serving mayor of Detroit, was born. In a 2018 tribute, the Detroit Free Press described him as unapologetically black. The Michigan Chronicle remembers him as the People's Mayor. The Alabama native was outspoken, brazen, and a character whose legacy in Detroit is duplicitous just like its politics. Before Young rose to power, racially charged riots in 1967 changed the complexion of the city. According to the Detroit Almanac, a deep polarization between races grew out of that riot and accelerated the white exodus out of the city. When voters elected Young in 1973, the former union organizer became a hero to some black voters who saw his victory as a sign of their growing power in local government. He promised these voters a better life, but many feel he never delivered on that promise and instead used racial animus to fuel pursuits of political power. This led to racial divisions on the assembly line and coincided with the demise of the auto industry in Detroit, all under Young's watch. He encouraged whites to leave Detroit, and along with them went the money and the businesses. Under Young, Detroit grew into one of the blackest cities in America, with its suburbs being among the whitest. In the early 70s, when institutions and businesses were moving out of the city, Young was committing to stopping the flood with the construction of the Joe Louis Arena, an ode to his childhood friend and former heavyweight champion. Later, he would be partially responsible for the Joe Louis monument being erected near Detroit City Hall. The famous fist became a statutory embodiment of the racial politics challenging the region. Today, the statue sits outside of what is now called Coleman A. Young Municipal Center. In the months after George Floyd was slowly, cruelly murdered by police in the middle of a Minneapolis street, streets across America, and indeed the world, filled with people demanding justice, asserting that Black Lives Matter, rising in solidarity of decency. A Pew Research Center report in late June 2020 found that 6% of American adults said they attended a protest or rally that focused on issues related to race or racial equality in the month preceding the survey. That's about 15 million people, an astonishing number. The percentage of protesters who were white was nearly 3 times the percentage who were black. The percentage who were Hispanic was higher than the percentage who were black as well. But those protests were not happening in a vacuum. They coincided with the first major global pandemic to hit the world in a century, COVID-19. This country, like others around the world, basically shut down. People were trapped at home, inside, waiting for the plague to pass. Rites of passage, proms, graduations, weddings were no more. Congregational outlets, parties, movies, concerts, sports were put on hold. The social part of society collapsed. You could be shamed or even ticketed for gathering. But along came the protest. People could congregate without being greeted with contempt. You could be with your friends in an effort that would be honorable. So the question has always been how to detangle the two forces, COVID and racial consciousness. How true was the outpouring of allyship, and how durable would it be? Some disappointing answers came quickly. A few months out, white people's support for Black Lives Matter began to slide back to its pre-George Floyd levels. What explains this? Black people continue to be killed by the police. Were the protests a cabin fever racial consciousness? Did white people lose faith as the protests became marked by violence? Was their passion for honoring lives other than their own simply too hard to maintain? 1 year after George Floyd was killed, we're still left with questions. What was the meaning of last summer? Was it truly a shift, or was it a blip? We'll be back with more Black History Moments after this.
It's a real honor to be standing, to just be standing here today. Being behind this podium, being in this room, being in this building is not about one person. It's about, what we do on behalf of the American people.
While we often default to looking back, it's important to remember and celebrate the fact that Black history is still being made every day in this country. Take White House Deputy Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, for example. Today, she became the first openly gay woman to deliver the White House press briefing and only the second Black woman in history to take on the role. She deserves to be championed 3 times over.
I'm a Black woman, I'm gay, I am a mom. Both my parents were born in Haiti, and they came here for the American dream.
Jean-Pierre is only the second Black woman to serve as press secretary. Judy Smith, who served as deputy press secretary to President George H.W. Bush in 1991, was the first Black woman to take on the role. Jean-Pierre stepped to the podium today carrying the weight of Black women who know all too well being the first of her kind to do something in 2021. Another example of how the monuments of discrimination are still being chiseled down, one barrier-breaking moment at a time. Jean-Pierre is seen as a potential successor to current White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, who has publicly said she only intends to serve in the role for about a year. And today's briefing may well have been an audition. Simone Sanders probably put it best when she congratulated Jean-Pierre on making history in a tweet saying that the ancestors are proud. Indeed, they are proud, Simone. Indeed, they are proud.
It was like going to war every day. We had threats and comments that, we would be killed. The principal of the school told me at one point along the way that I didn't have to come to the ceremony. They would mail me my diploma. And I thought, listen, I didn't go through all this to pass up the ceremony.
It's graduation season. Nearly 4 million high school students from across the country will celebrate a major accomplishment. For Black graduates, this joy is forever amplified by the quiet reckonings of history and those who laid the foundation to make their educational experience possible. On this day in 1958, Dr. Martin Luther King, in the audience, a member of the Little Rock Nine, Ernest Green, became the first African American to graduate from Central High. He was the first of the group to complete school. The Little Rock Nine were a courageous collection of Black students caught in the center of Southern resistance and a constitutional crisis. The state of Arkansas sought to defy the federal government's mandate to desegregate the schools after the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education. A night before the group was to begin school, the governor called out Arkansas's National Guard to block their entry. But later in September, President Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division to uphold the Supreme Court's decision and get the students to Central High safely.
I have today issued an executive order directing the use of troops under federal authority to aid in the execution of federal law at Little Rock, Arkansas.
Green has said during the first few weeks of school, each of the Little Rock Nine had an individual soldier escort them from class to class. In the midst of overwhelming racial hatred, Green and the 8 others persevered so that today's students don't have to. He and his peers paved the way for millions of African American high school graduates that will celebrate in the weeks to come. So, if there are any recent or upcoming graduates watching this show tonight, as you move your tassels and toss your hat, just take a moment to celebrate the sacrifices of those like Ernest Green and the Little Rock Nine. More Black History Moments coming up right after this. Memorial Day is upon us, a time when we pay tribute to all veterans who died serving this country. Yet there is no Memorial Day without Black people, figuratively and quite literally. Black people, both enslaved and freedmen, have fought and died in every war the U.S. has ever taken part in. History is packed with contributions of Black soldiers like Crispus Attucks, who after his death in the Boston Massacre is considered to be the first American to die for the cause of the Revolution in 1770. Or Robert Smalls, the Civil War hero who commandeered a Confederate ship and delivered it to the Union side in 1862. Or Harlem's Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry Regiment, known for being one of the first Black regiments to serve in World War I. Or my very own grandfather, Fred Rose, on the right, a member of the 92nd Infantry Division, the now famous Buffalo Soldiers during World War II. He was the first among the Buffalo Soldiers to be recommended for a Distinguished Service Cross, according to surviving records. But also, there would be no Memorial Day without Black people. The holiday became known as Memorial Day in 1918 and has been officially observed since 1971. In May of 1868, Union General John Logan dubbed May 30th Decoration Day. He was inaccurately credited with starting the holiday tradition, but historians discovered the true origins of the commemoration through a Harvard University archive. In the final months of the Civil War, the Confederate Army converted a racehorse track into a prison for Union soldiers. More than 200 of them died due to poor conditions. Their bodies were discarded in a mass grave. Eventually, the Union Army emerged victorious. Later, a group of black workmen in Charleston dug up the bodies and reburied them to properly honor the fallen soldiers. According to the historian David Blythe, who is credited with bringing the story to light, Charleston residents held a huge parade of about 10,000 people led by black children who carried flowers to decorate the graves of the soldiers. After the procession, they gathered on the racetrack, read scriptures, and sang. It was the first performance of Memorial Day. So we celebrate those thoughtful souls who in May of 1865 laid the groundwork for one of the country's most honored traditions. We also celebrate all those who have sacrificed their lives for our freedom. And this year, Memorial Day coincides with the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race riots, where black veterans fought back in Oklahoma. For all of this, we give honor. And that is for the culture.